Marcus Aurelius is writing in his personal journal, and basically it's like ideas to himself how to live more virtuously. Like he starts it off by thanking his grandfather, thanking his mother, and I was blown away by this piece of work because this guy's like way better than me. That brought a weird question in my mind that I brought to my pastor. I'm like, well, he's not Christian. He's not filled with the Holy Spirit. He's living post Christ in the second century. Where is he? Where is this guy? And so my pastor's a strict confessional Lutheran, and he's a good guy. And he's like, he's in hell. I'm like, what? He's in hell. Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus Aurelius is in hell, and I'm not. That brought up other questions, like, what about the founding fathers? Like, I respect those guys. They're heretics. They're in hell too, if you talk to a lot of Christians.
So a few weeks back, a father of 5 named William Patrick reached out to me on Facebook, telling me he found my channel as he was investigating the church. He said he would love to talk to me about his journey. So I invited him on, along with my friend Brad Whitbeck, and what followed was a truly remarkable and uplifting conversation. So cool. William, first and foremost, I think I'm very curious. I mean, we've talked a little bit. Brad is obviously just meeting you for the first time. Tell a little bit about your kind of story, how you got to know the church and ended up talking with us.
Yeah. Dang. So I've been a Christian for about 14 years. I grew up nominally Christian, but I didn't take it seriously until I met my wife. And we met. She lived in the city, so at that time we were just going to like a non-denominational church in the city. And so during this time, I just wanted to understand what I believed. I'm going to fast forward. We ended up in a Lutheran church. We saw a Calvinist church, but we ended up in a Lutheran church. And it was during COVID. Things were happening with COVID with my church that were kind of weird. It was shutting down. And I started asking questions that I just never really had solid answers for. And one of them had to do with hell. And so at the time I was reading Marcus Aurelius, and I don't know if are you guys familiar with that?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So Marcus Aurelius is writing in his personal journal, and basically it's like ideas to himself how to live more virtuously. Like he starts it off by thanking his grandfather, thanking his mother. And I was blown away by this piece of work because this guy's like way better than me. He's incredible. And so, that brought a weird question in my mind that I brought to my pastor. I'm like, well, he's not Christian. He's not filled with the Holy Spirit. He's living post Christ in the second century. Where is he? Where is this guy? And so my pastor's a strict confessional Lutheran, and he's a good guy. And he's like, he's in hell. I'm like, what? He's in hell. Marcus Aurelius is in hell, and I'm not. And so we got into a discussion. He kind of like backed off a little bit. He's like, well, listen, we don't know exactly where he is. And so, all right, that's fine. But still, I think his answer was consistent with Christian thought. And so, that brought up other questions, like, what about the founding fathers? Like, I respect those guys. They're heretics. They're in hell too, if you talk to a lot of Christians. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington stopped taking the sacrament at the end of his life. And so
dirty deists.
Yeah. Well, so that was like the thread. And then once you start pulling on that thread, other things start to go too. And I'm trying to figure out how to make sense of all this. And I don't want my worldview to like just kind of spiral out and collapse. So I'm like, let me slow down and pump the brakes a little bit. And but let me table some things. And so what I did was like I had a bunch of things that I was struggling with. Hell was one of them. Trinity was another. For example, you talk to anyone regarding the Trinity in like a Christian church, you're not going to get an orthodox answer. You're going to get a heretical answer. They're not going to describe it right. And so this is a foundational concept within Christianity, and yet no one could seem to describe it. And so that for me is wild. And so that was another question I had. I had questions regarding free will and God's sovereignty and things like this. But C.S. Lewis was kind of a bridge, and the guy who influenced C.S. Lewis, his name is George MacDonald.
I love George.
Yeah. He was kind of like a parachute almost, where I was just like, all right, maybe I can be Christian, but I'll be like this universalist type Christian where I'm not saying everyone's saved, but maybe if you're a just person, God knows your heart. I found out that a lot of the universalist communities are like incredibly like leftist and liberal. And so I'm like, and then also I'm like outwardly rejected by a lot of Orthodox Christians. And so now I'm like I'm like the bat who can't fly with the birds or, be with the bees. And so someone said to me, like, a lot of your questions, man, they sound like, are you Mormon? I'm like, and now I'm in New York. And so all we have out here is Jehovah's Witnesses. We don't have Mormons. And so this is where the crazy stuff starts happening in my life. I'm up in Vermont with my wife, and some guy, I have 5 kids, by the way. Some guy comes up to me who's from Utah.
Just a small side note there. You have 5 kids. That's awesome, dude. That's
man.
That's 4. Why they think you're Mormon.
Exactly. That's why.
No. So he comes up to me. I'm up in Vermont, and he's like trying to, I guess, test if I'm Mormon or not. Because he's like, so what church you guys go to? And he turns out to be Mormon. And he's like super passionate about the Mormon faith. Super, like in the middle of a conversation, he's like, wait right here. And he like runs out to his car and like hands me a book of Mormon. He's like, read this. He throws his email on the book. All right, no problem. And so that was like a weird thing. And so started reading the Book of Mormon. And, my only knowledge of Mormonism was informed by the culture, unfortunately.
That's pretty standard. Yeah.
Yeah. And, it's like, I don't watch South Park, but of course I know the Mormon episode, right? So,
oh yeah.
But I open up the Book of Mormon and you see the witnesses, you see the 3 witnesses, you see the 8 witnesses, and so these are people who either helped translate or held in the plates, and so it's like, all right, so this is not just a Joseph Smith story. This is like there's other people involved, and so. There's more to what I've been originally led on. And so let me peel back the layers here. And so as I peeled back, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's visions and there's experiences and there's all these stories. And I'm like, and the Book of Mormon itself is so incredibly complex and magical and beautiful. And it's a great story. And I'm like learning things as I'm reading it. I'm like, what is going on here? And so, again, let me pump the brakes and let me figure out. So this has been my journey thus far. I have a deep respect for the Book of Mormon. But
why? What? I'd like to hear a little more about why that is. As somebody, especially the fact that you mentioned its complexity and stuff. Like this is something that a lot of people don't grasp early on, the complexity of the Book of Mormon is pretty astounding, and its spiritual power, obviously, on top of that, for me, is what really kind of seals the deal. But what you say you have a ton of respect for the Book of Mormon. What do you mean by that? What are you referring to? What comes to mind?
Well, it's one. People might look at it and be like, "Oh, it conveniently answers questions." It answers questions on free will and things like that, and that's not really. That's helpful for me, but it's not my biggest takeaway. The takeaway is the story and the characters involved. It's really a great story about God. And so I have a group of friends privately that I talk theology with, and a lot of them are Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. I'm like, guys, this is an incredible text. And I tell them how, all the evidence for it. And so after I'm done kind of presenting my evidence for the Book of Mormon, one of my friends is like, yeah, well, it was probably inspired by a demon or a fallen. I'm like, okay, fine. So he at least admits that it's supernatural, like it has a supernatural origin. I go, there's one problem with that. I'm like, it's saturated with declaring Jesus Christ as Lord. And so that's a major, like, how you can't do that. Like, demons don't do that, right? Only angels of God do that. And so, yeah, I guess I would be more the story, the story itself of Nephi traveling.
Could I actually share something real quick, just on that line of the Book of Mormon being inspired by a demon? I'm just going to read something that I have, some of my favorite parts of the Book of Mormon. Like, I always want to ask people that say that, oh, it's inspired by a demon, be like, so the demon wrote this, and we talk of Christ, we rejoice in Christ, we preach of Christ, and we prophesy of Christ, that our children may know to what source they may look for a remission of their sins. Or this one, and now seeing that ye know the light by which ye may judge, which light is the light of Christ, I beseech ye that ye will search diligently in the light of Christ. And if ye will lay hold upon every good thing and condemn it not, ye certainly will be a child of Christ.
That's awesome.
I'm just like,
that's beautiful. Yeah.
I know. I read that and I'm just like, that just kind of shocks me, in the sense of, like, there are a lot of arguments you can make against the Book of Mormon. But saying that it's inspired by the devil is one that I have the hardest time with.
And if I can jump in on that, I think this is part of why Christ gave us the advice that, hey, you should beware of false prophets, but it's by their fruits that you shall know them, right? Yeah. And with the Book of Mormon, that there is a fruit guiding people back to Christ, right? Teaching them of the Savior.
Yeah.
So how did you end up getting introduced to, like, are you meeting with missionaries right now, or what's how did that all happen?
So the guy who actually originally gave me the Book of Mormon, he would send me verses and they think about this verse and ask me questions and things like this. And, have you gone to your local church? And, I was putting it off. Becoming Mormon for me would be a total cultural change for me. And so I've been, what is my wife going to think? What is my family going to think? What are my friends going to think? But he actually got in touch with some missionaries. They came over there. And that's another thing is, like, when you're looking at a worldview and we talk about fruit, you look at the type of people the worldview produces. And that for me is fruit. And these guys, every Mormon I've met, industrious, knowledgeable, hardworking, physically healthy, smart, and somewhat always successful.
Don't hey, easy. I got my flaws, man. Don't. No,
listen. I'm being honest with what I've seen, and so there's something to it. There's something to this worldview actually producing people that are special, and
absolutely.
And so that you take that into consideration, especially as a father who has to marry some daughter someday, and I would love for them to marry Mormons.
So one thing with that, you just mentioned that. It's funny because this has always been one of those things that, for me, it's funny that you're going this direction and you're thinking about those things, the fruits, and not just the Book of Mormon itself, but also what it produces. Like, I always tell people, like, if there's a book out there that when people read it, they end up being more giving, more loving, more faithful, more Christ-like, like, why is it crazy to think that maybe God has something to do with that book? And the wild thing is that, and I'll bring this into the conversation, is the social science literature. So there's sort of a trope out there about Latter-day Saints. Like, they're just like, these nice but naive kind of like neighbors, but they're really like nice people. You know what I mean?
Boy Scouts almost, right? Like,
they're like Boy Scouts, but they're, they're kind of naive.
Right.
Well, it goes beyond that. It's actually wild. So there's been some science or social science literature, like that Latter-day Saints, for instance, you were talking about health. Latter-day Saints live 7 years longer than the average person in America.
Wow.
Like, it's like, here, join this church, you'll live 7 years longer. Like, that's kind of like, that's a thing. And then there's, like, Latter-day Saints actually know their Bibles. 2010, Pew Research did a research on Christian groups, and they tested them on, who's this biblical character, kind of like a little test to see if they understood the Bible. Latter-day Saints scored the highest.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, wait, that's weird. Latter-day Saint temple marriages, you're talking about marriages. Catholics, for instance, they're big on preventing divorce, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
Latter-day Saint temple marriages are 3 to 5 times less likely to end in divorce than other marriages. And Latter-day Saint marriages, not only are they more stable, they have more children than any other religious group.
Yeah.
And you start looking at that and you go, this is wild. And more charitable giving, volunteer work. You start looking at this and going, man, if our society seems to be crumbling, like something seems to be going well here.
Yeah.
Connected to this group. And I'm not doing that as any kind of a brag. We have our problems. You'll find Latter-day Saints that are terrible. You'll find, we get divorced too. Like, I don't want to go too far with this.
No, yeah.
But there is a real power when you spend your life studying those kind of words that center your life on Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. I think, what you're going to see, and this is just my prediction, there's been a massive shift within the Protestant world. A lot of my friends who were evangelical moved to Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy for like the epistemic security of formulating doctrine that gives. Yeah. I think what you're going to see, because no one really takes the LDS Church seriously, but I think what you're going to see is
we know missions.
People are going to start looking at this church and start taking it seriously, because they're going to need to, because the fruit you guys produce and what you guys have as a religion.
Well, that's what I'm hoping. I'm actually doing a debate. Do you know who Trent Horn is?
I do. Yeah.
So me and Trent Horn are debating the Book of Mormon on August 22nd.
Smart guy. Very smart guy.
Super smart guy. I'm kind of nervous for the debate. But my hope is that I can, my whole goal in the debate is just to show people that you need to take this seriously, right? People need to stop sort of it's kind of like atheists with the Bible that just kind of like, they get a surface level and they just kind of laugh it off.
Yeah.
And people do that with Mormonism.
Well,
but it's like Christians should know better than that.
One of the weirdest objections to the Book of Mormon is like the archaeological. It's like we don't have, not to my knowledge, archaeological evidence of the Book of Exodus and Moses leaving Egypt, right? Yep. So but yet we believe that. That's a major part of our faith, and so. That's always a weird one for me. It's like, well, okay, if we do find like bronze in North America or something like that, are you going to become Mormon and like realize that it's right? And so
I even had somebody on my mission kind of jokingly say, hey, have you guys seen the gold plates recently? And I called out to him, actually, yeah, I've got it in the back of my car. It was our turn to have them. Lucky thing. And he's like, you don't really have them. I'm like, yeah, but if I did, would it have changed your mind? And he stopped and thought about it for a second. He's like, probably wouldn't, huh? I'm like, yeah, I think that's part of why God does not have them with us right now. He wants us to walk by faith and not by sight.
Yeah.
To be moving forward, learning these things. He doesn't want us to be convinced by chariots found at the bottom of the Red Sea. He wants us to be convinced by living his word, by seeking for him. That's who he is. He's our Father, and he needs us to choose him, not to convince us through whatever archaeological evidence or other kinds of evidence are out there. That's
100%.
There's
not the fruit Christ is wanting us to look for.
There's a problem out there they call it's called the hiddenness of God problem. I'm preparing a video on this for my channel. And that is there's sort of the objection that's like, if God wants us to like love him and have a relationship with him, like why doesn't he just like pop out and be like, hey guys, like right in the sky, like, hi, I'm God, like I'm here, without an understanding that there's an aspect of the hiddenness of God that's necessary for what his purposes are. There's an assumption there, that like I oftentimes think about the Garden of Eden story. Remember, God's in the garden, but they have to leave it. See, my kids, if I keep my kids in my house with me, that's actually a problem for them. at some point they have to go out into the world. Now, that doesn't mean I leave them alone, but there's a line in which it's like you can be involved enough, but too much involvement messes up the experience that they need to have.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I really do believe that God will give us enough evidence for us to be able to still be rational, to have rational belief and reasons for belief, but that ultimately we have to trust. There's that step of faith that's required. Now, it doesn't mean it's blind faith, that there aren't reasons for this faith.
Right.
But it still has to be something that requires a level of trust.
Right.
And
So
that's something that's helped me.
When Peter sees Christ and he steps outside the boat in the storm, he had good reasons to believe Christ, that he could trust Christ, right? It wasn't blind faith. He saw Christ do miracles. He heard Christ teach sermons. And so he was stepping out on faith. It wasn't blind faith. It was faith that was built up by evidence. And so that's how we should approach these things.
Agreed. 100%.
Very well put.
So, all right. So as far as getting involved with the church and the missionaries and stuff, he ends up, the guy that you met in Vermont.
We still talk almost every day.
That's awesome. Super cool.
Dude, that's great.
Yeah.
And he ends up having some missionaries come by. So you start to get to know the missionaries. How's that whole experience been?
That has been really cool. They're great guys. I'm the type of person, like, when I'm given something, I dive in myself, and kind of, with YouTube and stuff, you can learn things pretty fast. And so I've been doing my own research, but they've also have like a lesson plan. And it's good to kind of go over the basics, because you think you know something, but you really don't. And so, but also I have to, you don't want to do this journey by yourself, and like I end up somewhere, and now my wife, my family is like, wait, we're still evangelical. What's going on? So bring, the first night that we were having them over, I asked Mom, hey, sweetie, we're having Mormon missionaries over. She's like, what? It wound up being great, and the bishop actually came over to my house, and we sat down, we talked, and so it's been a cool experience because my family's been involved. I think that's the most important thing.
And have you guys had a chance to go to church?
You want to hear a funny story?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. Here's a funny story. So I was an elder in the Lutheran church, and that's another story. There was like some sin issues, and I fell away from the church, not on my part, but within the leadership. And we just walked away from the church. And so we've kind of been in limbo trying to find a church. And so we don't have a home church right now. So we've been trying different churches, and my wife is feeling sick one day. I have my son, and I'm like, listen, she's going to stay home. Today's a perfect day for me to check out the Mormon church. And so I bring my son down. We go, I don't tell anyone. I don't tell missionaries. I don't tell the bishop. We go during fast and testimony day. Okay. And so I'm like, listen, I want to sit in the back. I want to observe everything. I just want to see, get the lay of the land here. What's going on? What's their liturgy like? And so my son sitting next to me, and they let some guy walk up, and he starts giving his testimony. And it sounds like it's going to be like the craziest testimony. I'm like, oh my gosh. But the guy winds up going off the deep end. He's talking about how he's like the reincarnation of Christ. And I'm like, what the heck? And he's like, he like took a time machine, and I guess they let him talk for a little bit. And my son's like looking at me. He's like, Dad, is this true? I'm like, I don't think so. I don't think this is how it's supposed to go.
And I guarantee you, any of the members that were there, that knew you were there, were all going like this, because we've all been there.
I saw the missionaries like kind of like put their head. I'm like, listen, here's the deal. I've been in the church culture enough where you invite your friends to church, and like that's the day like your pastor's out sick, and you get some like random dude giving a message, and you're like, what, God, what, really? So I've been in those situations where I'm not going to let it affect really, but I don't think I'll go to a fast and testimony meeting as my, to bring my family back.
Yeah, especially New York. Fast and testimony meetings in New York can get funky. So,
yeah. A little bit of open mic night. So that was your one experience?
One experience. Yep. One experience.
Okay. Well, you got to go back to a regular meeting. We got to get you into a good one.
Yeah, I'm all about it.
So tell me about the kind of progress that's made in this journey from the beginning. You first start learning about this thing. You start reading the Book of Mormon. What other things are going on in this experience?
I may have like a backwards way into Mormonism, because reading the Book of Mormon, like I said, I love it, but that's actually not what like really kind of catches my attention. What catches my attention is like I guess you would call them the restored doctrines. So, for example, the premortal life. When I heard that, and when it was taught to me and explained to me, I'm like, I've always believed that. That's something that just rung true to me. We're pilgrims here, and like my memory's been wiped. I want to go back to that place. It's home, and yeah, that like I am eternal in that sense, and so that rang true to me. And so little doctrines like, it's not little, but doctrines like that, the different tiers of heaven, like that's an amazing beauty. Like if that's true, that is so amazingly good news. And so I know where Marcus Aurelius could be. It's great.
Exactly. Yeah. It was fascinating, actually. So when I was on my mission out in New York, I ended up, it was like a joke, actually, the beginning of this. My companion and I were in Union Square. We ran into these two Buddhist monks and we started talking. And then a professor from Columbia University was walking past and was like, "Oh, I have to hear what this conversation is. Like, can I just like step in?" We're like, "Absolutely, why not?" And so he stepped in and we started talking, and he said, I have this question that my father had on his deathbed that I've never heard a religion answer well, and I want to hear what you guys have to say. And as he's saying this, a Vishnite Hindu guy shows up. And he's like, "This is even better. Like, come on, join us. Like, I want to hear what you have to say." And he ended up asking the question that his father had, which was actually your very question that you have. Like, say somebody lived their life as a totally devout Catholic, but he goes to heaven or he goes to the pearly gates and finds out, oh, Catholicism wasn't necessarily correct, right? What happens? Right. And how can God be just? How can God be merciful if he just sends this guy straight to hell, right? If he sends him to hell, he's not really merciful. But if he just lets him into heaven, he's also no longer just. Yeah. So how do you get around this? And so when we answered him and gave him the plan of salvation and that pamphlet you've probably seen from the Missionary, he's like, where is this from? Like, this is amazing. I have never seen an answer like this. This is perfect. It was so amazing. And so, I'm totally with you that this, I'm glad that you grasp it too, because sometimes people don't recognize the way that the degrees of glory in heaven enables the justice and mercy of God to be complete.
Yeah, indeed.
One of the things with that too, on top of what Brad said, is it's interesting when you start to reframe the entire endeavor as, instead of God sort of, well, if you cross this particular line, you got to go to heaven, or if you don't cross that line, then you go to hell. Where I often tell people, look, God is trying to take you as far as you are willing to go. Marcus Aurelius went as far as he could in this life with what he had. Yeah. And he developed his character in such a way in this life that I would say that in the next life, that there still is a chance that he will continue to progress. And in the kingdoms of glory, it's sort of like, how far are you going to go? The ones who make it to the celestial kingdom are those who basically don't put a cap on it. They say, I'll go as far as you'll take me, Lord. Right. Like, I'm yours. Yeah. And when you reframe it like that, it's like, but then it leads into the things that, people kind of laugh about. It's like, Mormons are crazy. They think they can become gods, but it's sort of like,
well, Jesus became, right? Like,
yes. And the question is if you're going in that direction, if you're progressing, if this concept of progression exists, well, then what's the limit? Like,
it's
maybe
you got to be joint heirs with Christ.
Yes.
The Bible says this.
And this isn't crazy doctrine. I mean, even within certain traditions, you start getting into the concepts of deification and theosis, and it starts to be like, I mean, they're like, well, but God is a different thing. And it's like, but if we are children of God, if we are of the same kind as him on a spiritual level, that there's the possibility of us to have this sort of progression. And people, again, kind of like the atheist who's like, sky daddy, ha ha ha. It's like, people can be like, oh, you guys like think you're going to get your one planet one day. And it's sort of just like, it's a mockery of something that needs to be understood as, in this deeper way. And just, if you talk about it differently, people get it. And they're like, well, that actually makes a lot of sense.
I'm going to paraphrase. C.S. Lewis says something along the lines of, if you saw someone who died and came back, you would have every inclination to fall down and worship that being who you saw. And so we are on this journey to be glorified. And we see aspects of that with it's Peter and John that go up to the Mount Transfiguration.
Yep.
Right. They want to worship Moses and Elijah. Right. And so, it's really cool.
Yeah. I would, are you, now it's funny you mentioned C.S. Lewis. We kind of, there's a joke in the church that C.S. Lewis is one of our honorary apostles because he's so frequently quoted.
He gets it though.
He does. And what he says aligns extremely well with what we teach, with the exception of the doctrine of the Trinity. That's the one chapter when you read Mere Christianity as a Latter-day Saint, you're kind of like, Lewis, everything up to this point has been fantastic here. I got a little bit of a difference, but I'm a huge C.S. Lewis fan. I've read
Great Divorce. Have you read The Great Divorce?
Yes, The Great Divorce is probably, I think, his best book. No. Actually, I take that back. No, I take that back. The Great Divorce is fantastic. Super connected with our ideas of like
a post-mortem repentance type.
Yes. And the other one, though, that I think is actually his book is The Abolition of Man. You haven't read that one. And it was funny, though. I read it. I didn't I enjoyed it. But then I read a book that analyzed it because I didn't realize how profound that book was.
Right.
And then I was like, so good. So good. Yeah. Anyway. So
now that we fanboyed C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
Sufficient.
So doctrines are the things that have really caught your attention.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a shame in a way because it's almost broken me. Once you grasp these doctrines, which are beautiful, and it's almost like you have a puzzle in front of you when you're doing theology, and you want to put the puzzles together. It gives you puzzle pieces, and you're like, oh, this fits perfect here. And you're able to see the full picture. And it's like now if I have to walk away from the system, now I have to take those pieces that made sense of the other pieces, and now I'm like, it kind of broke me in a way,
I once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
And it's funny you say that because that's people have different sort of testimonies of the church for different reasons and of the gospel. I would also, it's so funny. I feel like we're like, William, we're very, very similar guys because the doctrines are the number one reason I am a Latter-day Saint and that I believe in the restoration. I mean, a guy comes up and tells me he sees God. It's like, all right, they're interesting. They're interesting things, but miraculous things are just miraculous things.
Right.
But when out of those miracles comes a theology that is like,
there's no way he put this together on his own.
You start going, but the problem is that like these doctrines are true.
Like,
they actually, if God is the just God that we think that he is, then these things, like I can't see how it could be some other way. And so I'm so glad that you're grasping some of those things.
Listen, my background, like I said, I grew up nominally Christian, but my family is like very much Pentecostal. My grandparents came over from Ireland, and so my grandfather was Irish Catholic. And on my grandfather's deathbed, they're trying to have him say the Jesus prayer. And like, listen, their intentions are well-meaning. I'm not, but at the same point, like if they thought if that didn't happen, he's going to hell. and that's like such a, if you like just look at the psychological realism of that whole thing, it's wild. They're thinking they're pleading with God to say a prayer that he has a proper view of God, and by faith, that he can get out of Rome, that he's going to go to hell. I'm like, that's a very weird view, in my opinion. And so when I see the Mormons, I'm like, this is a holistic system. Like, God is not looking to like damn you if you don't have intellectual assent of the proper concepts. And
that is such a, again, that's one of those distinctions in Latter-day Saint theology compared to other groups, where it is about belief in a sense.
Yeah.
Because from our beliefs, these good changes in us happen. It's about conversion.
Yeah.
It's about transformation through Christ from the inside out, because we trust him and we are willing to try and do his will and align with what is for us the celestial order of things. And people will, to one degree or another, be willing to approach that,
Yeah.
And God bless our Catholic and evangelical friends who see, they look at us as dangerous because we might convince people to think things that aren't correct, and that'll get you sent to hell. Whereas for us, it's like, I am so happy that you guys are getting people to the level that you're getting them.
Sure.
It's wonderful. I just am like, and guess what? We can take
more.
even further. Like, we got even more puzzle pieces here.
Exactly.
Fantastic.
And it's cool because I feel like it fits in with the plan that a all-knowing, all-loving God would have.
Yeah.
Because in order for us to grow, we have to work with one another of our own volition, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, we can't have that growth. He can't force that growth on us, right? And so I think that's an amazing thing, the way that it works.
Yeah. Oh, Jacob, you're muted.
Sorry. So you are going through this experience. You're investigating the church, reading the Book of Mormon. Where are you at now? Where would you say that where have you gone, and where have you kind of arrived at this point?
I don't want to go bump in the night down the road and come up with any type of like, I wish I would have known this before I jumped in. That's just the way I work. Maybe not the best way. Maybe I should, kind of just on faith. I think I'm like the guy I speak to up in Vermont. He's like, listen, you've had a lot of different experiences and, conclusions. He's like, I think you're ready. But
have you before we go into that, have you had any special experiences in this journey?
Oh, jeez. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, see, and that's, and I'm curious to hear about those.
Reading about, I think, so when you read Joseph Smith and you read, the original, the first vision, there's a part of you that kind of wants that. You want the pillar of light over your head, and you want God, and you want angels, and you want visions. And so that was my thing, is like, if I'm doing this, I want one of those awesome experiences. And it sounds so foolish, I know, but that's just was the way I was thinking. I was like, this is the only way I'm becoming Mormon. But truthfully, if you look at Revelation, how God gives inspiration, at least in my context, it's been small, it's been piecemeal, it's been, you get like a flash, and then it'll go away, and you're left with your doubts again. But then you'll get another flash, and you'll get another piece of inspiration. And so it's almost like collecting those pieces of inspiration. And I'm not sure why God does this, but collecting those pieces of inspiration where I've been, just doing something. It's like, I'll get a flash of like the beauty of, Mormon theology, and it'll inspire me and give me and bolster my faith. And so I've had those experiences. I've also had other experiences. Do you want me to share those or no?
Yeah, absolutely. Share
okay.
Away.
I mean, I was going to get into, so one of the big tripping points for me was the word of wisdom. Still kind of is, but Jacob, you said we're a lot alike. I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as well. So I'm a blue belt Too
Hey,
strive.
me too. We need to roll sometime.
Yeah,
Nice.
man. Absolutely.
Beat me up.
The big thing for me was like, do I really have to give up coffee and tea and an occasional beer?
Mm.
That for me was like, honestly, it was something keeping me from moving forward. And so the guy who runs my gym, he's super fit, like crazy fit, and he comes up to me one day and listen, I got a dad bod, and he's like, listen, you got to level up. You can actually lose weight. You can get better. And he's like, I want you to do these two things. Okay. And this is just to provide context. This is as I'm studying Mormonism. And this is as I'm like, being like, I can never do the word of wisdom. If I'm doing it, maybe I'll be one of those guys who just like continues to drink coffee or something. He goes like this. He goes, I want you to give up alcohol and I want you to stop drinking caffeine. I'm like, wait a second. I'm like, wait a second, what? He's like, alcohol is it's adding weight to you. And then I'm like, well, okay, fine. I get the alcohol thing. Maybe I'll cut that out. Why caffeine? And he actually called it a neurotoxin. He was going to give me a book on it and stuff like that. And he said, stop drinking it. It's keeping you up, stuff like that. So we talked about it. And that for me was like, what are the chances of that happening?
Yeah, and the timing of it, right? Like that's phenomenal. Yeah.
Yeah. So little things like that keep
me
on
and
happening.
Brad have both served missions, and I can tell you right now, the story you're giving is not something that I have found to be overly unique. I can't tell you how many times that I've had people who were sincerely seeking, and I think that's a big part of what happens is when you sincerely seek.
Yeah.
I believe that God will answer your prayers. He may not like give you a pillar of fire over your head, but things will happen that will tell you that will signal to you personally in some way that like, I'm here, I'm listening, and I have answers for you.
So I actually have committed to the word of wisdom.
Awesome.
Dude, that's great.
Yeah. And two things happened. First, it's like 2 weeks in and my wife comes up to me, no lie. She goes, it's like, what's gone into you? You have like way more energy. Like I'm like, she's like, you're doing way more chores. What's going, that was one thing. And the second thing happened, which is crazy, was I just got back from Ireland, and my thing was like, listen, I'm doing the word of wisdom, but when I'm in Ireland, I'm gonna indulge. And so I was at a pub with my family, and I'm like, listen, I'm gonna do it all at once. I'm gonna have an Irish coffee. I wound up having two. It's a coffee with whiskey. So I drank that. I leave the bar, and I'm walking around. I'm loving this little town. I'm looking around, and my wife's like, hey, Bill, where's your two daughters? Where's Kiva and Taylor? I'm like, I was supposed to be watching them? And she goes, yeah, you were walking with them the whole time. And I was not paying attention. And at that moment, I'm like, listen, there's too much going on in my life where I can just like relax and not be vigilant and not be sober. And so that was on the other side where I was like, yeah, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm done with alcohol. So.
Oh, wow.
I'll tell you this, whether you end up in the church or not, that is a commitment that will bless your life. Like I've had, and I mean, obviously people drink for the reasons that they drink, but the blessings of my life, I know my personality. I know my history in my family. I know what alcohol has done. And I know the ones in my family who've left the faith and have gotten into alcohol. It's never gone right for them.
Yeah.
And I look at things like coffee, a lot of people wonder, why coffee? To me, it's this, coffee is the example that's given by the church, and it is the thing that's kind of focused on, but it's really just a freedom from something that ends up being like your fix that you need. And I don't think that it's good.
The way that you'll hear people say things like, "Oh, don't talk to me till I've had my morning coffee," right? Like there's a level of dependency that people develop that's unhealthy. And that's kind of how the word of wisdom starts, with a warning. It's for the weak and the weakest of all saints. right? While some people might look at it and be like, I could handle the occasional beer, I could handle the occasional coffee. It's like, yeah, but as a people, we're going to take this commitment for those who can't, which is my family. Because just like with yours, Jacob, that's
we're the weakest. I'm
yes.
one of them.
We have the very addictive personalities running through my family.
Once you step away, and I don't know about the cultures where you live, but once I stepped away from it, you realize how much everything revolves around coffee. It's like, oh, I gotta go to Dunkin' Donuts, gotta go. I'm like, dude, it's kind of weird, honestly,
And anytime, and I'm this way with any substance, you are not meant to run on these sorts of substances that alter your conscious states.
Yeah.
In my mind, it's like if I can keep because there's a question, what is sort of the ideal stuff to put into your body?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the word of wisdom, in a way, gears us towards those ideals, and it gives us some specific things as a people that's like, we're going to make a commitment to these things, right? And it's funny, of all the principles in the gospel, the one that I have like the biggest testimony of, even if you'd find out, this is a big sham thing, I would take the word of wisdom with me. 100%. I would not start to drink. I just have seen too much. Anyway, I could go on and on about it, but I think that's wonderful that you're making that commitment.
And one thing I want to note, because you said like, maybe I don't understand exactly what's going on with stuff like tea as well, right?
Yeah.
And something that I found really fascinating is this is part of, I think, being a covenant people, right? Where there are things that Jews had a health code as well, where the kosher guidelines on food, there are some very specific guidelines on that. And some of them, like within the word of wisdom, there are some very good reasons for things like alcohol, and I think for things like coffee, but maybe it gets a little bit more confusing on things like tea. Why precisely are we being asked to avoid tea? And to me, part of it comes back to, this is maybe something where God is just asking us to trust him and show that level of commitment. Say, hey, I am going to take this on to show you that I trust you, that I believe in you. And even if I don't know precisely why you would want me to avoid this thing, heck, maybe it's just so that we'll have conversations about it, right? Maybe that's why it is, to help us to talk to one another about, hey, why do we commit to God to do these sorts of things? And so I view the word of wisdom as more than just the health code. I think that there is our willingness to show God that we are willing to give up these things in order to come to know him better. That's even the more important aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So I want to go back. So you said you've had some of these experiences. Any others that you can think of besides the word of wisdom one?
Yeah. So my wife, basically, she's like, listen, you got to tell me what you're going through. What are you doing right now? Are we still Lutheran? Are you still Lutheran? And it was in my kitchen. I'm like, listen, we're driving out east, which was like an hour drive the next day. I'm like, we're going to talk. We're going to have a full conversation. And so we were driving out to, we're going to an engagement party, and we're having this long discussion. And the missionaries had given me some videos. And so I played a video for her of Joseph Smith, and the video started out, I guess, Joseph, before he has the pillar of light, he gets surrounded by darkness. And my wife had some, a troubling childhood, and she used to pray through that. And she goes, that really resonated with me, because I used to feel like darkness would come upon me. I would pray, and that would just go away. And so she's like, that's a really weird description that he would give. And then also during that car ride, there was one other doctrine that I was really struggling with, and it's like tithing. Now, tithing for me, I didn't really understand I didn't understand how it worked within your church, but I didn't want to be sitting down with someone and they're looking at my finances and I'm have to. And so I'm like, I'm really like, listen, I'm skeptical of like going into an institution and now I'm like obligated to give them money. And she goes, listen to me. And this is during the same car ride. She goes, it's so weird that you are talking about this right now because it has been placed on my heart that we need to start tithing at like our church more. And I'm like, that was one of those things like, how does this happen? Right? Like, how does the thing I'm struggling with, my wife is actually praying about that we should be doing more, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, the Lord will reveal himself in various ways.
Yeah. Dude, that's amazing.
It is pretty cool. It is cool.
So, so you said, so as of right now, so you, how long has this all been going on? How long has it been since you first kind of got involved with the missionaries and this experience? And how long would you say this journey has been?
I said about a year.
About a year.
I mean, little more than a year, probably a year and like 4 months, but yeah.
Awesome.
And how the heck did you end up contacting me?
I found your YouTube, like I watch your show. I think it's great.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. How did you end up finding out about my YouTube channel?
I don't know. I think I probably just threw it in the search engine and you had like some interesting subtitles. I'm like, oh, what's going on here? And I like the way you approach epistemology. I like the way you break things down. You understand like how to talk about different ideas. And so I'm like, yeah, this guy gets it. And so I joined your Facebook group and you know.
That one gets a little more wild.
Yeah.
Well, I always tell people like
it's fun to watch though, man.
It's kind of a train wreck in there because it's Facebook, but there are some good conversations that come out of it too.
Yeah.
Well, so where are you at right now? How would you describe to people where you're at and what you're feeling?
Well, you know, I'm kind of like I'm swinging between two worldviews right now, and so I'm like trying to swing back, and I need to bring my family on this journey with me. And obviously, the LDS faith, you guys are about family, and I need for this to move forward. I need to have my wife on board, and I need to, you know, my son's actually already on board.
Oh wow.
And so I'm kind of. She has questions for me. She's been, you know, looking at stuff, and it's hard too. Like when you're going into this, YouTube is a great tool, or it could be a great, you know, testimony killer. You know,
very much so.
The Exmo stuff online is crazy. You know, man, it is crazy.
It really is.
And so, you know, just trying to navigate that and just be careful. And there's so much misinformation about your faith that I just want to make sure we have the proper answers. I have the proper answers for her. And so that's really where I'm at.
That's awesome. You know, just because you seem like the kind of guy who might benefit from this, because I know you'll continue studying long after this conversation, but have you ever run into Mormoner.org? No. So something really cool that Mormoner.org is doing is they are pulling together all of the primary source documents for every question that you might have questions about, right? So that because you're talking about how you see things online and how much of this is misinformation, how much of it isn't. I have the anti-Mormons telling me this thing. I have the Mormons saying, no, that's not true. But like, how do I know what really happened? And who knows, maybe the Mormon that's telling you this isn't true is off a little bit in their estimation, or maybe the anti-Mormon is really laying it on thick about this thing, right? And so Mormoner.org is a really awesome resource to be able to look into the primary sources around these things, where you can look at those for yourself and make that judgment call and try to decide, look, hey, I have whatever issue it is that might be having you guys go for a loop. You can go and look there and try to decide. Because one thing that I find, and of course, maybe this is my bias, right? I find very often that anti-Mormon presentations of what we believe will very often rely on one to a few primary sources that do exist. They are there. But then they privilege that above the 50 other sources that are saying the thing that we actually believe, right? And so that is one of the things that I think, I don't know, you seem like the kind of guy that this may be a useful tool for you down the line.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like it's Joseph Smith and all the other prophets. There's more written about them than any other previous prophet that would have existed, right? And so you know all the nitty gritty details about their lives that you may have not known about, Moses or something
About
like
Moses,
that.
exactly, yeah.
And so, you have to take that into consideration. And I'm absolutely convinced that if Christ walked among us, even though he's perfect, we would probably be like, oh, what's going on with him, right? There's some flaws there, and he was perfect because the people of his day were doing that to him. So
yeah, I can't help but think about in this entire kind of exploration of faith is there's sort of all the evidences and the reasons for it, right? And I believe that those are important, and I have a channel that talks all about it. But when I get into with someone where where there's a level where you're intellectualizing it, and then there's a level to where this is something that's spiritual, right? And I don't believe in having a faith that doesn't connect your head with your heart, right? Like I believe you have both for a reason. But I do believe at some point there is that step of faith, and there is the words of Paul, where he talks about that the things of God are known. I'm trying to find it right here. Here it is. Or maybe that wasn't it. I'm sorry. I thought I had it here. Anyway, I know the verse. I was going to see if I could read it directly here. Where he says that we know we get to discern spiritual things spiritually. And it's funny because he was speaking to the Greeks, who are a hyper-rationalist group. And he was saying that, look, fundamentally, you come to the Lord through a call from him that you respond to. It will involve your head for sure. But at some point, like Christ said, you do the doctrine and then you know that it's from God, right? And I think your word of wisdom story to a certain extent is an example of that, right?
Yeah.
It isn't that you found all the answers, right? It's something
by
happened.
experience.
It's an experience with God, with the church. And again, I always have to tell people, because I have there's both extremes. They're the people that hyper rationalize their faith to where it's literally just like a scientific and analytical thing, which is like, yeah, that's good, but it's missing something.
Yeah.
It's the science without the music. And then there's other people where it's just like, hey, this feels good, I'm in. And then they find out a few facts and they're like, maybe not. And it's like,
it's a balance. It's a balance.
It's that balance. It's an integration of both.
And if I can offer a very useful illustration that I don't know if the missionaries may have shared this with you already, but it's the idea that God won't steer a parked car, right? That he won't tell you to turn left or right until you start moving forward. Because it's not even going to matter if he tells you to turn left or right, because you crank on that wheel, but you're not moving, nothing's going to happen, right? And so he requires us to make decisions and start moving forward. And then he starts giving that guidance, right? Like all of these experiences that you've just talked about are the kind of thing where you're taking the chance to move forward on faith, right? And say, you know what? I'm going to try the word of wisdom. I'm going to see where this goes. And as you move forward, trying to do that, then God shows you the fruit of those things, right? Yeah. He wants us to take action, because if we freeze up and we end up deciding that we're not going to take action until some criteria is met, then we end up having, I think, a much more difficult time discerning between truth and error. Because like Jacob was quoting earlier, if any man will do God's will, then he'll know the doctrine. And it's as we move forward that we start to learn these things. So I think it's very good that Jacob brings that up, because I sometimes, being Canadian, I'll tell people like, oh yeah, just whatever's more comfortable, right? And then I'm like, no, that's not actually the way the gospel
That's
works,
funny.
is it? And so like, I think that it's fascinating. Something that's been on my mind recently is how, you know, how the right brain is more creative and the left brain is more logical. And your eyes are connected to one half each, right? It's kind of like how if you don't have both eyes open, you don't have the right depth perception, right? And if your eyes were to be, one is your spiritual sight and the other is this rational sight,
Right.
you want both out there. You want both active in order for you to be going. The scriptures talk about this all the time, and how you need to know things with your mind and with your heart. And I think the things that we're talking about here, that's how you get to know both of those things. And if we wait to know things rationally before we'll let it affect our heart, I think we sell ourselves short. And it, at the very least, will slow down our progress a lot more than we might want to. I think that's the kind of thing where God will reward the effort that we put in.
You know, coming into this, I already have a testimony to Jesus Christ. And I had a friend once ask me, you know, if you took away the historical evidences and stuff like that, would you still believe? And I said, yeah, I would. Because my faith is not built on that. My faith was built on actually reading the words of Christ and being drawn in by him. And so that's where I'm starting with. I built my faith on experience, and then kind of went back and, you know, looked at it and said, yeah, this is actually something I could stand on for a worldview, and bring my family on too, and live in.
And
And
as the scriptures say, blessed are you, Simon, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it to you, but my Father which is in heaven.
and yeah, beautiful.
And I can tell, obviously you have 5 kids and you're married, and that's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
You're doing it right.
Is that, I imagine that your family is at the center of your world.
Oh, 100%.
As mine is. How familiar are you with the doctrines that we have about the family and why the family matters so much?
Honestly, I know about the sealings in the temple for marriage for eternity. I don't really know why. I just know it's like something that continues on after this life.
Yeah, and I would say that the most beautiful doctrine for me is the church's doctrines around the family, because it connects to the thing that matters most. If you ask anybody that is sane what matters most in their life, they're going to talk about a relationship. That's what matters most, right? Now, generally believers will say their relationship with God, and rightfully so. We love God first. But the next thing that he says is to love our neighbors. Well, I can tell you who the neighbor is that's closest to you. And she might be in the other room right now. And that's who you start with your love. And then it expands outward to your children, to your extended family. And the gospel is meant to put you in right relationship with God first, but then second, to put you in right relationship with your fellow man. And the restored gospel does this in a very interesting way, because it defines those relationships. It says that you as Adam was in the garden are not complete without your Eve. The male and the female, the masculine and the feminine, are two complementary yins and yangs that are meant to be together, because they're greater together than if they're apart. And this isn't just a temporary institution for this life. In the Latter-day Saint conception of eternity brought through the prophet Joseph Smith, it's that the union of man and wife it creates the necessary conditions for your highest potential. And it's funny because you know that. Because all of us guys know that if you don't have that person by your side, you're missing something.
Mm-hmm.
And the restored gospel gives you a spiritual understanding as to why that is, in the context of an eternal scheme that says you are meant to be together with her, you are meant to have children, and that is meant to make you a co-participant with God in the creative endeavor of life itself. It's the essence not only of your life on earth, but your life into eternity.
And something that I want to add to that is, if you think about the creation in the very beginning that we have in the scriptures, Adam and Eve were made partners by God before death was put into the world. And so there's this eternal nature to their union that supersedes. It came before death, you know? And now we have this idea in the world that we're married till death do us part, you know? And I think that, I don't know, that just like Jacob said, this idea that we can be with our families for eternity, this is something that I think is intrinsic in a proper understanding of who God is, showing us his love for his only begotten son. Family is central to even who God is, his relationship with his son, his relationship with us as his other children. And so that family, I think, is so deeply important. And I think that that's part of why. And I think we're honestly going to continue learning and understanding why marriage must be eternal down the line. I think Paul even acknowledges this when he says that neither is the man without the woman, nor the woman without the man in the Lord. It's something that we need one another. Like, again, like Jacob was saying, that the masculine and feminine balance each other in a certain way and they are combined in a certain way. It's fascinating when you start looking into the Greek and the Hebrew. I'm learning biblical Hebrew right now. And when you look into some of the older scriptures in the Old Testament, some of the things that they'll say about God's wisdom, it's always this feminine idea. And it's like, oh, what's going on here? Like, this is really fascinating. But I know that there is this familial focus in the eternal scope of what God has us here for.
Yeah.
And so I think that's maybe a beginning to a bit of an answer to your question there.
Yeah. And, you know, one of the questions, and this is, you know, my wife not even knowing that I was doing this research, is several months ago, she asked me, she goes, you know, what do we believe happens to us after marriage? And I have to be honest, like coming out of like the evangelical world, they don't have an answer. They don't have an answer. It's a mystery. Are we together? Are we not? And so that for her was heartbreaking, you know, to hear that answer. And so it's another puzzle piece that you put in. It connects the dots. So
And that's what the sealing ultimately is. It is basically saying, it's manifesting your intention to God that we, and your commitment that we want this forever. If you go and you get married under the impression that this is only until death, I mean, that's what you're signing up for. But we are offering to anyone who's willing to enter into these covenants the opportunity to say, no, for us, this will be an eternal bond, because this is something that we continue to have throughout the eternity, because we believe that we are incomplete without this type of a relationship for one another or with one another. And so, again, I have found, and now on the flip side, I'm going to address a critique here that people will bring up. And that is that, oh, well, what? Do you think God's going to rip your family apart just because you don't get into a certain building? It's like, I think it misses the point. I think it's that it isn't that he's tearing us apart. It's that we don't want it. It's like he's offered you the chance to do this, but you didn't want it. It's like he's offered the priesthood to seal you together, and you chose that you only wanted a marriage for this life.
Or that if you're not following the kind of commandments that you need to be able to make that covenant, you won't be the kind of person that can stand being with someone for eternity. You know,
Yep.
I find, because I found this on my mission as well. There were some New Yorkers where when I was talking with them about this, they're like, I don't even want to be around my family right now. I'm like, that's what you want to fix. Like fix that so that you can want to be with them for eternity, right? And that I think echoes into this, right? It's do you want to develop the kind of relationship that can last for eternity? Because just like Jacob was saying, that I think people might misunderstand it that way. God, like I've heard people say, I don't believe in a God that would separate families. And I'm like, I don't either.
Yeah, me either.
I think that he is helping us understand that if we are not keeping his commandments and living the way that he wants us to, we won't be able to maintain those relationships through eternity.
He'll take us as far as we are willing to go.
That's awesome.
And okay, so I know you had some questions for us.
Yeah.
That we wanted to dig into.
I have a bunch of questions.
Let's dig in.
All right, sounds good. So I'm going to start with epistemic questions. So can prophets be wrong on doctrine?
Can prophets be wrong on doctrine? Well, let me just preface this first for anyone who's watching, is that I'm not going to claim that I have all the answers to these questions. I don't think Brad will either, but we'll try our best to give we'll try our best to give those answers. Now, that's a big question that's debated amongst Latter-day Saints to a certain extent.
I'm asking.
But here's the reality. We do not believe in infallibility of any man on earth except for Jesus Christ. So if you're talking about can a human being be in error or be infallible in anything, I reject that personally outright because you're a human being. And so we don't have any sort of a papal infallibility. It's like, hey, if they say it in general conference from the pulpit, or even if all 12 agree, that means that there's no chance that it could be wrong. That's just not our doctrine because of a more fundamental doctrine, as I see it, of the fallibility of human beings.
And
fair enough.
Something that might be useful to illustrate this, considering your background, there is a phrase that I think is very funny. That is that the Catholics, they have this doctrine of papal infallibility, right?
Yeah.
They have doctrinally, the Pope cannot be wrong, but the people act like he can be, right? Like they very much act like he can be. In our church, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we do not have a doctrine of infallibility. The prophet can be wrong. And yet there are many who act like he cannot be, right? There are people who get into this mode that like, oh, of course he could never be wrong. But I think just like Jacob has said, we have imperfect men who are doing their best, just like we are, to deliver God's word unto us, right? Every word of God that's coming to us through them is coming through them as a filter. And that doesn't mean that they're unreliable and that they can't give us good truth that brings us closer to God. But it does mean that they just because they're a prophet, that doesn't mean God gets rid of their agency now. And now they can't make mistakes, right? And so I think it's part of how God enables all of us to grow, because that prophet still has to grow to become more like our Savior. Yeah. He still has to be in the process of learning more truth. And so I think the prophets do their best to give us as much truth as they can. But like Jacob said, that doesn't mean they won't make mistakes ever.
You know, I had to kind of come up with my own answers to this. So some of the ways I've thought about this is like, all of us are kind of prophets in a sense, right? We're all picking up.
You sound like somebody named Joseph Smith who basically said the same thing. Go ahead.
So we're all prophets in a sense. And I look at it like maybe if you have like an antenna on your head, maybe the antenna for the prophets are higher than mine. But they're still having to discern the inspiration and the impressions that they get. And sometimes maybe there's some static or noise, and they're getting a flash and they're reaching into that inspiration, and maybe they're not articulating it right, or maybe they're not describing it right, but they have some. So that's how I kind of look at this is maybe sometimes when you see like Brigham Young teaching on some crazy doctrine, maybe
interesting ideas from time to time, just so you know, don't worry about it. It's all
maybe
good.
He's reaching into some like inspiration that he's just not understanding correctly. You know, and so,
or he's not communicating it effectively, right?
Exactly.
And he totally gets it, but because of the limitations of our own language, or the guy who wrote down what Brigham Young was saying, right?
Right.
And then we read what that guy wrote, and we're like, oh, that's weird. It turns out
So
Brigham might have been saying something different, right? There's enough layers that I think it gives us the opportunity to, how are we going to approach this? Are we going to bring it to God, or are we going to let it slow us down?
So I asked a question to some friends. It was regarding Genesis, and obviously Moses wrote that. It's like, well, how did Moses get that inspiration? Was it like a flash? Was it communicated audibly? Was he shown a vision? And I believe Genesis was like kind of maybe put on his heart, and he's writing things down, but he's also writing things down under, like, he's with his own character. He's, how he understands the world. He's putting together words and concepts and phrases.
Absolutely.
And right. And so is Genesis literal? Well, in a sense it is, but also in another sense it's not, right? And so there could be a lot of missing pieces in that, and he's just grabbing onto like the main ideas and putting it together in a narrative.
I think that's
so
a great way to think of it.
Perfect.
I would say this as well, because one of the things that comes up, because what the infallibility question is about, it ultimately is about, well, if they're not infallible, then how can we trust what they say? Well, I say the same way I trust the 12 greatest brain surgeons to give me good advice about my brain cancer that I have, right? I say the standard is not infallibility. The standard is reliability. And what you find in the what I call the prophetic tradition, or the collective prophetic witness, or other ways that I'll talk about it. But what I find is the most reliable source of spiritual truth out there. And what happens is when I live those spiritual truths, I gain a witness that this is, these are good brain surgeons. They seem to be the outcomes of what happens in your life, the fruits of these people, as Christ taught, manifest truth, beauty, goodness. And that is why I go to them as a source of the spiritual wisdom. Now, you said one other thing that was really cool, I think. You said we all are kind of like prophets, but you said, well, maybe their antenna goes up higher. I actually disagree. I think that God is just as willing and wanting to give you revelation over your family as he does to the president of the church.
That's awesome.
And not only that, I believe that you have different spiritual gifts, and Joseph had different spiritual gifts. And there are some people like full on revelations in their sleep and dreams happen. That's never happened for me.
Right.
I think that God will communicate to people in the way that they will be receptive to if they seek him, and he will do it for the stewardship that they have. The prophet's different between me. Now, I would say that he is much better at seeking the will of God than me, just because I know their character. But fundamentally, it's not like this. God doesn't want to give me what he gives to them. The difference is just a matter of stewardship, fundamentally. He's being given revelation for the whole church, where I'm being given revelation for the stewardship that I've been given.
And this is how you have a church that has order while still enabling people to exercise their own autonomy and be people who act and aren't just acted upon.
Yeah.
And you see this a lot with early Joseph Smith quotes. There are many stories of people who will ask Joseph Smith a question, and they'll be like, ask God, what should I do about this? He's like, what if you asked God, though, right? Like, he'll respond like, hey, you should be asking God. You should be turning to God to ask, just like Jacob is saying, for things within your stewardship.
Yeah.
And so you see this in an early instance in the church. There's a guy who started receiving revelations for the church as a whole, right? And it's like, oh, what's going to happen here, right? Like, now this other guy is getting stuff that's saying the church should do this, right? And it comes down that
competing voices.
Exactly, right? And it comes down that is not how God operates. He's a God of order, but he will allow you to receive inspiration for your own stewardship, like Jacob was saying.
That's awesome.
So like he's saying, you said we're all prophets, and yeah, that's the goal. He wants us to all have that intimate connection with him.
That's awesome. So I guess moving into the next question. Listen, we're living in a chaotic world. Fundamental truths are being attacked. Long-stead doctrines are being attacked in evangelical churches. And by the way, Jacob, you're going against Trent Horn. Look up Council of Florence versus Vatican II. You're going to see a little bit of changes in terms of how they.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, but so if doctrine or if prophets can be wrong on doctrine, can fundamental doctrines change in the church that you're in? Can doctrines on the family change? Can doctrines on marriage change?
So, couple of thoughts there. It depends on what you're going to define as a fundamental, unchangeable doctrine.
Okay.
So, what I say is that truth doesn't change. So, what things are true will not change. Okay. Now, and so the question is doctrinally speaking, what, like, there's the question of what constitutes doctrine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in one sense, you can say it's the official teachings of the church at any given time, right? So you have the church can have the positions that it has right now, but I go personally a step deeper here because this gets into an area that a lot of Latter-day Saints debate. Those who don't have authority debate this, but from the actual mouth of the people who hold the apostolic keys in our church, they have said on the doctrine of marriage specifically, no, it will not change, and it cannot change because of the doctrines related to the plan of salvation, which are firmly established.
Right.
And so from the authorized key holders,
Yeah.
they have said this is a truth, and
Right.
it will not change. Now, those who will say, well, they said other things in the past, maybe that
Right.
they no longer say.
And an example would be, that you hear is polygamy and the racial ban on the priesthood. Those change.
I'll hit these two as being fundamentally different. First of all, the criteria that I'll use here is the collective prophetic tradition. Okay. Because if you have a prophet that can err, right, they'll err, but how can we tell that they've erred? Well, you can look at the entire prophetic tradition and say, this guy has gone off. They've contradicted, not a change, a contradiction to what the prophets of God have taught in the past. Okay. That's an issue. Now, let's talk about those issues specifically. Race in the priesthood in the church. First of all, there's no revelation that was ever officially given saying that was supposed to happen. Okay. Later prophets did come out and say that they believed it was a doctrine of the church. But if you actually look at the bases for those, there's a whole giant discussion to have about that.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you can tell it was not ordained of God, in my opinion, some people have different opinions about that, is that this was a false tradition that entered the church because of the prophetic tradition. It contradicts it. Okay. Polygamy is an interesting one. Our doctrine on polygamy has not ever really changed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The doctrine is in Jacob 2 in the Book of Mormon, which predates anything that went on in Utah. And what it says is that monogamy is the norm, and God at times, for specific reasons, will command this. And that's exactly what happened in our history.
If you believe the Bible, that's true.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Abraham, Jacob, you
David,
see this as separate times.
That's a question I always have for people who are like, polygamy. Well, it's like, you realize God blesses David with wives, and it's said by the priest, like, I've given you these wives.
Yeah.
The house of Israel is literally a polygamist household.
Yeah.
And like Jacob is saying, this isn't something that even changed. This is something that, within the context of polygamy being something that is commanded at times by God and then revoked at times by God, that's precisely what happened. It was commanded for a time. That I think that's why the church even still exists. I don't think
really
the church would have continued to exist without it.
Yeah. I agree.
The way that the saints here in Utah were able to survive. I mean, I'm a descendant of a polygamous union. I wouldn't be here without it, right? And this is something where, specifically in Jacob 2, it says, if I will raise up righteous seed unto me, I will command it, right? And so, to me, polygamy, it's not a thing that the church changed its mind. It went forward the way that the scriptures talk about. And like Jacob mentioned, with the things that happened with the priesthood ban, I find this a really fascinating moment in history where you have, after Joseph Smith's death, all of these people coming together trying to ask, what did Joseph have to say about this question? And trying to figure it out. And you find that there's a couple of guys involved who, one of them is Zebedee Coltrane, who talks about how he was advised by the prophet to not baptize slaves, right? Because they did not want to aggravate people at the time. They were trying not to cause more dissension. They were getting attacked by mobs in Missouri, right? And so he took that to mean, oh, we shouldn't be baptizing or preaching to people of color, which is kind of an extrapolation beyond what was said. And so
It
I think,
contradicts the Book of Mormon.
yes, it contradicts the Book of Mormon. I think they were trying to do their best to understand what was going on. And it's an instance where, when I look at it, they're turning towards experience and towards men rather than turning towards the scriptures, right? To get this idea that they then perpetuated for, I think, too long.
Yeah.
But it's the kind of thing where if they were going back to the scriptures, like Jacob said, those scriptures don't really align with what happened there.
No. And again, the scriptures are, that's also code word for the prophetic tradition, right? That's what we rely on to sort of check these things. Now, here's my
Right.
question. Does gay marriage contradict the prophetic tradition? Yes. Wildly so. More than any other. I can see how people might have misconstrued certain scriptures or certain ideas into thinking, having certain racial theories. But marriage between a man and a woman, I mean, and
That's
no,
from the beginning. It predates death, like we talked about before.
The Adam and Eve archetype, the way our temple liturgies work, which is something that you eventually would learn about, it's all based on a liturgy that takes you through as though you are both Adam and Eve, and that you both, like, together, you are able to reach your highest potential because you have an Adam and an Eve. I mean, when you start to talk about gay marriage, the amount of things it would contradict are just crazy. And so what the prophets of our church, remember, you can hear what anybody says online, some activist who thinks, oh, well, the church will eventually change its doctrine because it changed it on blacks in the priesthood. It's like, yeah, maybe one day they'll just deny that Jesus is the Christ, Is it possible? Sure. I mean, it's possible logically, but is there any reason to think that that would actually happen based on what they are out saying? They have been saying, and I have a video on it of all of the cuts that they say, and they say the same thing very specifically. This is something that is core to our plan of salvation. The priesthood ban was never meant, it does not fall in the same category. And so to just say, well, because that changed, that means this can change, it's poor logic, it's poor theology, and it contradicts, in my opinion, members of the church who say that. And I'm pretty bold on this. I think that they need to have leaders in the church talk to them and tell them to stop publicly saying things like that, because they are contradicting what the key holders, what the prophets are saying today. And so they're causing confusion in the church. And for people like you, they're making you think that this is something that would change. And I would say, don't listen to those people.
Yeah.
Go listen to the Lord's prophets that he's called.
Well, one of the little inspirations I've had is, step away from social media during this time. Because there's so many conflicting ideas and it's so confusing. And it's like, nah, let me just build this testimony on solid ground, on the scriptures and stuff like that.
Yes, the scriptures.
That's
go
perfect.
there. That's where scriptures over social media. That is my go-to.
Really?
The only influencer you need in your life is the Holy Ghost. But one thing I do want to add with what Jacob has said is when we look at what happens with polygamy specifically, I've seen people occasionally bring up, oh, well, you have Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball occasionally tell people like, oh, this if you don't live this now, you can't go to heaven, right? And so they'll bring these up as though this is something that like is intended for eternity and there's no way around it. But when I look at those quotes in their context, I come to understand they're not talking about polygamy there. They're talking about obedience. They're talking about following what God is saying at this time, right?
Gotcha.
And so every single person in the congregation, when they're saying those things, is someone who is commanded to live polygamy. And so in the time that God commanded it. And so, again, I don't think that these are things that are going to change at all. The church's stance on eternal marriage is not going to change. In fact, there's been revelation on that, on eternal marriage being what it will be forever. And it always has
I've
been.
read the family proclamation. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's perfect. And man, you wouldn't have thought it was prophetic back in the 90s, right? But here we
That's for
are.
sure. That's for sure.
And just so everyone knows, we talk about polygamy. We don't practice polygamy. And not only that, polygamy is incredibly uncomfortable. And it's not like we're sitting here like, oh man, remember the good old days when we had more than one? Okay. My take and most Latter-day Saints opinion about polygamy, first of all, is it's very awkward and uncomfortable of a conversation to have. And number two is that I believe it was a sacrifice for those who were involved. If a person just wants to, have more sex, believe me, having wives and family that you have to take care of is
it's not easier.
No,
That's
it's not the easy way. And
No.
and not only that, I look at what's going on today with all the divorce and I'm almost like, you guys, people like criticize polygamy, and then you have a guy who's like has baby mamas with like a whole bunch of different women, and I'm like, and they're not, and it's weird because like in those relationships, not only do they have those situations, then they're not married, meaning he has no obligation to even care for these people.
Yeah.
And so while
it's a false outrage.
Yeah, I mean,
in a lot of instances, and to verify what Jacob's saying here, my ancestor that I mentioned, who was polygamist, he and his wife prayed about it to understand and ask God, is this something you're really asking us to do? And they came to the conclusion that it was something he was asking them to do then, right? This wasn't something that they just ran into head first or decided, hey, or the man comes home and says, here's how things are going to be now, right? They prayed about this together and then determined that it was the right thing to be doing. And I think that that's how it goes with
God has not revealed that to me, and he told our prophet that anyone who thinks God is telling them that now is wrong.
Yeah.
It's not time for that, and you will get excommunicated from the church if you engage in plural marriage. So anyway, so just like for Christians, actually it's weird though, comparative Christianity, I think weirdly enough, the polygamy stuff is one of the reasons I actually am a Latter-day Saint, because I look at it and I go, this is the best reconciliation to the fact that it existed in the Bible out there.
Yeah.
Because everyone else just
You
seems
want to hear a crazy
like,
story that people
ignore
don't
it.
know about?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Luther actually allowed a polygamous marriage during the Reformation because he couldn't disprove it from Scripture.
Really?
And it was something that the Roman Catholics actually used to discredit the Reformation.
Oh, wow.
Well, I gotta
did
say,
not know that.
People have certain things about the Bible on that they say, they try to make arguments. I've never found them very compelling. And frankly, again, not a fan of polygamy, but I believe that it is something that the Lord can use under certain conditions if the people involved pray and get the right answer.
Do you know, the way that I've come to view it, the more I've studied it, is it's actually very similar to war. There are times where, like, God does not want us at war with people at all times, but there are times when it's necessary, right?
Right.
And I think it's similar with polygamy. That he's got times where it is required. But man, it is so much better to live in times where that is not the norm,
Yes.
Right.
One is plenty for me. Anyway, all right.
Does that answer your question, or
Yeah,
is there
no,
anything?
absolutely. Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah. Move on to the next question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. Now, this is actually among talking to my Christian friends. It's not like the biggest one for me, but among talking to other Christians, this is like the one that will get the most feisty, angry. They hate this. So, King Follett discourse.
Oh yeah.
You have Joseph Smith state, God himself was once an exalted man and once as we were. Now, this begs the question, does God have gods above him? How did he come into being? Is there an infinite regress of gods? Where are we going with this? Because,
Let
go ahead.
me. Can I take this one first, Brad? I want to.
Absolutely, yeah.
I.
And then I have a fun question that I think helps respond to this well.
So you're gonna find. I have someone who kind of helps me on this podcast sometimes. Hayden Carroll, good friend of mine. Both of us, faithful Latter-day Saints. We both teach seminary, which is it isn't like a seminary, isn't like a Catholic seminary. It's a youth. It's for basically high school age kids. Bible study every single day before school, scripture study.
Awesome.
And we have a disagreement over this, and there are two schools of thoughts on this subject. One school of thought is the infinite regress sort of conception of God, right? That he has a father, then he has a father, then he has a father. Hayden subscribes to that. I actually don't. I subscribe to what I call Blake Ostler is a great theologian who holds this view, is monarchical monotheism. In the Bible, actually, and I largely based my conception of it on the Bible, is that there is a council of gods that is talked about, and then amongst that council, there is a head god. And if you actually look at Joseph Smith's teachings, and there's a lot of nuances to this, that Joseph himself even talks about the idea of a head god. And so the way I conceptualize it is that God the Father is the head god, the most, as they say, the most high God. That's what he is, and that he is eternal. And if he had some sort of an experience in order to attain where he is, fine. But that doesn't necessitate, in my mind, and this is a big, long sort of theological debate, it doesn't necessitate a God before him on to infinity. I believe in that it's sort of a one-way street. From him emits all of his children, and all of his children are able to become as he is.
Right.
So those are the two kind of schools of thought.
So the question would be then, how did he come into being? How did he become exalted?
So my answer to that would be that God has, he is always, when you talk about something that is eternal, then saying, well, I have this eternal thing. Well, when did it come into being? It's to not understand what I meant when I said eternal. Eternal things don't come into being, right? So
He was intelligence, right?
He was an intelligence. And also there is a, how do I even describe it? Yeah. How did God come to be? I would say my answer to that very simply is that God has always been God. And that if there is a contradiction with the King Follett discourse in that, then I would say, yeah, I would say that the King Follett discourse isn't even canonized scripture. Sure. It's a theological discourse given by Joseph Smith. Now, some people get really annoyed by that. Anyway, Brad.
and this is where I would say, first off, I think this is one of those things that we can't necessarily know in this life.
Right.
I think this has to do with things outside of the scope of the eternity that we find ourselves in. But I do want to add, there's this idea that I think kind of is underneath this question that ends up tying into the way that we view power in the world. And it's not the way that Christ viewed power. Because what did Christ say about he who is greatest among you, right? It's to let him be your servant.
Yeah.
Right? Now, when we ask the question, does God have a God? I I think that gets asked in a way that tends to mean, does that somehow lessen God because there's another additional God above him, if there is one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to that, I would ask, does it make your grandpa less of a grandpa because he has a grandpa?
Right.
Right? Does that rob him in any way of
No.
being a grandfather? No. It has this idea that there is, it's more of a familial thing in a way. And I think the way that God became God is actually quite similar to the way he is asking us to become like him, right? I think that maybe I'm landing a little bit closer to Hayden.
And that's fine. And just so you know too, I'm perfect. I would say I'm more persuaded by my sort of point of view, but I have no problem jumping over to the other one. I think they're both perfectly live options.
And I think that's part of it. We don't have a unified answer to this in the church.
Fine.
Yeah.
There needs to be more revelation, maybe.
Yeah.
Or maybe we will find out, on the other side of the veil.
And that's something I've wondered about. Is this something that comes to us after? And is there what would be the reason for us learning this after, right? And I think that's fascinating to consider, because there's a phrase that comes up in the scriptures that talks about a blindness that comes by looking beyond the mark. And some of these things, some questions like this, I think, end up getting us to a point of like blindness that comes from looking beyond the mark, because it's like God's looking at us being like, you want to ask this when you can't even be faithful, right? Like you haven't mastered faith yet.
To use Luther, Luther is often like noted for saying reason is a whore. And the reason, it's taken out of context, it's used by the Roman Catholic Church. The reason why he says that is sometimes you can go down this road of speculation so much, and that's what happened in Rome, where you start like answering these questions that have not even been revealed in Scripture. He goes, stick with what's revealed. Don't try to peek your head behind the curtain and put these things together that aren't there, where you're going to have purgatory for thousands of years. And so stick with what's revealed. Live with a mystery, which is part of having faith. And so that's where that quote comes from. And that's actually something like a principle I've always used in theology. It's like, listen, we can speculate all day long. That's fine. But let's stick with what's revealed.
Yeah.
And I would say too, there's a different stake in the game when you believe that proper theology is what ultimately you need in order to be saved.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
This is what Latter-day Saints get all the time. And it's one that we hear it and we're just kind of like, it's so outside of our paradigm that it doesn't register with us. And it's like, but you guys worship the wrong Jesus. Because the idea here is, if your conception of Jesus's nature is incorrect, you go to hell. And so it's like, wait a minute. Like that just doesn't register for me.
No.
Like, I don't think he cares that much about the right conception. Now, I think there's a level to which that it matters. But like, for instance, for them, your friends who are very passionate about this, they're passionate about this because for them, this sort of a theological issue could be the difference between going to heaven or to hell.
Right.
Are you worshiping the wrong God? It's like, if you conceptualize God the wrong way, where for us, we're like, that isn't the game. The game for a Latter-day Saint, and I believe this goes back biblically, is, are you in a covenant relationship with God?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Did you enter into a special kind? You might not quite understand everything about his nature, but do you understand the covenant you made?
Right.
And are you keeping it and striving to keep it? And that covenant relationship will allow you to progress line upon line, precept upon precept, not only in this life, but into the eternities, to understand these sorts of mysteries and questions that may be beyond answer, that right now all we're doing is speculating with various theological models and making different arguments, which is fine and fun and good. Like, but for me, I'm kind of like, that's why I said I can go either way. Like, I'm not, it's kind of like this cool question to kind of ponder, but what I care about is, did I make a covenant with Christ, who's the Redeemer of the world, and am I striving to keep it?
Right.
And
I almost think if Christ came back, he would have like a parable of the servant who could define him really well versus the servant who like obeyed his commands.
Uh-huh.
Right.
Yep.
which
Yeah.
is more faithful,
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
right? All right, another fun speculation question then, because I don't know if you guys have this defined doctrinally. In the Protestant world and Christianity in general, there's the concept of free will and God's sovereignty and foreknowledge. If we have free will, how much is this world or this life predetermined? How much does God have foreknowledge? Is there any openness to the future in terms of our ability to? Does God know everything that's going to happen? And so, where do you guys land on that?
You're jumping into the great questions that are still, you find different answers within our tradition.
Fair enough.
I personally, I don't know about Brad, but I personally am an open theist. And I believe it fits very well into Latter-day Saint theology, which is to say that essentially all prophecy is conditional, and that God is in a dynamic relationship with mankind. And that his foreknowledge, according to me as an open theist, is to know all things that it is possible to know. Okay. I do not myself, as an open theist, believe that all things, that the future actions of free agents can be known. Now, with all that said, I think that they can be, like, I can know if I put a cookie in front of my kid that he's going to eat it, but does that mean my kid doesn't have any free will? Like, no, it's just that I know my child extremely well. Now, that's my take, but I'll say right now, you could be a Latter-day Saint and have a totally different perspective. Brad.
So here's a question I have with this one. Who knows more? The God that knows one timeline and exactly what it's going to be like, or the God who knows every variable outcome of every possible timeline and how those intersect with one another, right? To me, how much greater is the foreknowledge of God, the omniscience of God, if he enables us to have the free will to choose what we will, right? I believe the vast majority of prophecy is conditional, but there's the occasional prophecy that doesn't seem to be conditional, and I can't tell if it's because it's delivered at a time when that the condition is passed, or if it's because something is set.
Well, you also have to deal with prayer, like people asking God to change his mind on something, and that happens. Right?
Exactly.
And so how do you make sense of that, right?
Yeah. And so I believe free will is a fundamental tenet of our religion, and it's a fundamental tenet of our lives here. I think it answers a majority of the questions we have with trouble with what's going on with God, because hey, he wants us to choose for ourselves. And in order for
that's
us,
where love really blossoms,
exactly.
Right.
And without free will, I don't.
Now let me tell you guys.
I see a point.
Before I was a Lutheran, I never became a member, but I was part of a Calvinist church.
Really?
Oh yeah. I read R.C. Sproul, and listen, give them a hard time. They're logically consistent on their stance.
I say the same thing.
Jacob says that a lot.
This is probably I have so much respect for the Calvinists. Once I understood what their arguments were, and then I was like, I almost was like, dang, I don't know how you other Christian groups, like, you guys have some real problems, because their arguments that they make on some of these issues, if you're going to posit this radical notion of an omni God, you run into the conflict of free will, and to square that circle is really hard unless you pull a really wild Joseph Smith move. And this is one of those, again, theological things that I'm like, this is like, how did he come up with a plausible answer, in my opinion, that solves the problem by saying, look, God fits within a certain set of constructs that are, we would call in Latter-day Saint theology, eternal law, that even he is subject to. And so God is all powerful in that he can do all things that are possible.
Right.
But there are limits on what are possible, and it is not possible to have love without free will, and it is not possible for God to have this perfect foreknowledge if they have free will. And so it's like, do you want love?
So this young kid is basically solving the most complex philosophical and theological problems of his day.
Yeah.
And it's like, what?
Yeah.
I'm telling you.
And he's not even doing it in such a way where it's like he's trying. He does it in such an outward fashion. He bridges it back in, right?
And he almost doesn't even realize he's doing it. Like you read the Book of Mormon, it's written, okay, the Book of Mormon was translated in 1828, 29, right? Is that correct? And at this time, Joseph is just like, everyone, he doesn't know anything. But what's wild is when you read the Book of Mormon, these concepts are in there. Alma 42 is one of my favorite chapters because it's the one that talks about this notion of God being subject to eternal law. Basically, and what's funny is Christians have the same concept. God is, he can't do that which is logically incoherent or contradictory. But that's to posit that there's some sort of a constraint on God, right? And so, yeah, Joseph just like in Alma 42, within another narrative, makes these points. I'm going, this, how? It's one of those things that, again, if you take, I think the reason, honestly, William, that you're having the experiences that you're having is because you're actually taking it seriously. And what we get so frustrated with as Latter-day Saints is that people just won't do that. Because once you peel back that onion and you kind of go, let me actually look into this with some seriousness, you start finding stuff that just is like, why is everybody laughing at this? Why are you guys all making jokes here? This is insane.
Here's the thing. It's a friend of mine put it this way. What's the best way to hide a unicorn? You make it look like its horn is just a hat, right? Because if it looks like it's just a horse wandering around with like this horn taped on its head, then it's not really a unicorn, right?
Sure.
And I feel like the way the world views the church has kind of painted it that way, right? Like this actual mythical creature is just kind of this party thing that isn't real, right? But there's so much depth and reality to this, and it's awesome.
Any other thoughts on that question?
No, I think that's good.
I have one just because I love bringing this up with Calvinists, and this is less to answer your question, but just like with which God is more omniscient, the one who knows one timeline or the one who knows all possible ones.
Sure.
I want to ask the question, which God is more all-powerful? The God who can and does have more children who can become like him, or the God who does not do that? Right?
Well, if you have the true Calvinist, the one who kind of will just swallow the pill, God gets glory out of bringing people to hell. And if you want to look at Jonathan Edwards' sermons, that's actually
that's true.
This is where, again, if you want to talk about something being demonic, and you read the Book of Mormon scriptures, and you say that's demonic, but the God who creates creatures to damn them to hell for his own.
And you got to think, a lot of the creatures that he's also creating are experiencing suffering in this life, right? So like, you have people in the jungle, you have people in wars, think about all the world wars and things like that.
Yeah.
There are people who are being born suffering immensely in this life only to, get to God and be like, I actually created you. You're a vessel of damnation. And that for me, I don't have, it strikes so hard against my moral sensibilities of who God is.
Yeah.
And it's like, I can't stomach that. I get the logical consistency part, but that's not good.
I think that's why one of the biggest reasons I'm a Latter-day Saint, because if I go to the Catholics, I go, you're logically inconsistent. If I go to the other Christian groups, I go, and then I look at the Calvinists, I'm like, yeah, you guys are logically consistent. But the problem is that the logical conclusion of your arguments is that God is a monster.
Yeah.
And then I'm going, okay, this is a problem. And then in rolls Joseph Smith, the doofus with a, farm guy who everyone was like, yeah, this guy isn't that bright. And all of a sudden he solves these sorts of problems, and on top of all the other stuff. And it's a remarkable thing to me. And ultimately, you gain a testimony. Again, these are all evidence things.
Yeah.
But they're not the testimony thing, right? That comes from an experience with God.
Yeah, 100%.
So,
yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, this is fun.
Cool. It is 12:30 by me, so I'm going to continue doing this. It's all good. It's all good. My brain starts to shut down after like 11:30. So
I only do this as long as you want.
How about this? I'm going to get through these next
ready.
set of questions, and then we'll, if you want to do this again, we can definitely do it. I would love that.
Sounds great.
Sounds good.
All right, historical questions. I've also had to think about some of these myself, so I have some thoughts. But regarding the Great Apostasy, when exactly did Christ Church fall away?
Ooh, I'm gonna do this. Actually, I will. I was gonna give this to Brad, but I do want to make a point on it first. Here's one of the big problems about the Great Apostasy discussions that people have. It's that they don't understand what we mean as Latter-day Saints when we talk about the apostasy. I'm going to have a conversation with Trent Horn before a debate, and that's one of the items I want to bring up. I want to say, look, the apostasy doesn't mean that all of these Christians were like these demons from hell all of a sudden, and every good person was lost from the earth until Joseph Smith showed up. Right. That's not the position of our church in any way. What we believe is that the keys of the kingdom that were given to Peter and the other apostles were taken from the earth. These were the power to seal on earth and to seal in heaven, because the people had rejected and perverted things sufficiently to where there was no more apostleship. So when did the apostasy begin? So far as I'm concerned, and as I define apostasy as the removal of the highest level of sealing keys on earth, that happened with the death of the last apostle that held those keys, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know exactly when that was, but
could be as early as the death of the original 12. It could be as late as maybe St. Nicholas. I like having St. Nicholas in there as an option.
So you guys, my thing is that, and so one of the things, and it isn't even about necessarily the corruption of the doctrine even. To a certain degree, we believe that happens when those keys are removed, and there was a perversion of doctrine over time, but it isn't primarily about doctrine. It's about authority. We do not believe that the church is on the earth once the keys are taken. That's what if we don't have the keys, we're just a Bible study club. Like, that's all we are.
Right.
We are a church because we have this special authority from God to effectuate covenants between him and the people through his priesthood power.
And so it's that authority to act in God's name that was lost, more than just truth in general, right?
And because specifically, the authority to effectuate those covenants, because people do have authority to like pray and to to do good works, right?
And even to work miracles. You see plenty of miracles through the beginning, through Christ's time, all the way to Joseph Smith, right? These are things that can happen and will happen. Right. But the restoration of the priesthood keys to act in God's name to officiate those covenants is something that was lost relatively early after Christ. I think it's fascinating to look at actually all of the Pauline epistles are a desperate plea from Paul to stop this falling away, right? And this is more of a doctrinal falling away as well. But I think this is part of why those keys didn't get passed on. I think these are connected in a way, right?
And it's connected to free will as well, right?
I was going to say, as an open theist, God is in a dance with humankind. He is trying to get us to do things, and the people didn't take to those keys, and so God took them as far as he could take them. And I believe that the great, wonderful Christian traditions that arose was the people doing what they could with the light that God was trying to give them.
And
Yeah.
God's working with that light.
Absolutely.
They're Christians.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And
That's what I don't think people understand when you start talking about this. Like, it's like,
Yeah.
Christianity kind of evaporated from the earth.
No.
No.
There's
Totally disagree.
there's real Christians working with revelation and doing the best they can to
Real saints.
Exactly.
I think
And-
when I look at Christian history, those people they're the reason that I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
I believe the entire Christian tradition shows that Christianity is true because of the demonstrable fruits that came from the great Christian movement. I just believe when I look at that Christianity, something is missing.
And you even see this in the early church history when you have missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints going into England, and they begin to teach people who are like, this is it. We've been waiting for this. We've been waiting for this restoration, because they recognize that a reformation was not enough to bring back what is lost. I find this fascinating in talking with people in Reformed Christianity. Where I'm like, look at what we're really offering and what we really are bringing to you. This is not something that's just some out there thing. This is the restoration of the actual authority to act in God's name, because you recognize something went wrong along the way, right?
Right.
Yeah, and
well,
so
even Protestants will recognize something went wrong. But what's interesting is, like, here's another evidence for Joseph Smith is he's actually making arguments that Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox make about the priesthood. Right? Like apostolic succession and things like this.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so how is he, in Protestant culture that he's growing up state New York, how is he making this connection that a lot of the historical churches, their biggest criticism against like something like Lutheranism is like, you guys don't have keys. You guys don't have authority to, baptize and stuff like that.
Yep. You're nothing more than a Bible club. If I go out and start a Bible club today and we all believe in Jesus, there's sort of within Protestant Christianity, that was a new thing. The idea has always been from the beginning of Christianity was the idea of certain people had certain authority, and those were the people who were baptizing and administering the communion and the other things within the church. The church was built on an authority structure. And then it was, and so I think for Latter-day Saints, we say, look, the Catholics are right to ask that question to the Protestants. And so it's funny, you were mentioning, Brad, the people, the reformers. Roger Williams of the 15th century recognized this situation. There's a famous quote from him where he says, "There is no regularly constituted Church of Christ on earth, nor any person qualified to administer any church ordinances, nor can there be until new apostles are sent by the great head of the church, for whose coming I am seeking." And so, in my mind, it is, and you want to talk about the fruits thing? The fruits of the Christians, and I think it's a Protestant point, the fruits of the Christians are beautiful in many, many ways. But the fruits of the church that emerged after the death of Christ, I have some real issues with saying that that was actually Christ's church operating under his keys. And so while I can make arguments from history, which I think you can make because there is no continuous quorum of the 12 apostles that continues after Jesus Christ, but even more so, the fruits that emerged from that institution, I have and that's what the Protestant
going to lead to the next question.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Because I actually have some ideas about that. But what is the great and abominable church? Were there any true Christians? We answer that, and any true churches. But go ahead.
Now,
Brad, you go first.
Surprisingly, this one's Scientologists. I'm just kidding. So
What?
you're like, wait a second.
What podcast?
So this one, when I look at the Great and Abominable Church, I do not think it is a specific organization the way that we would understand it. I think that there are people who are members of that Great and Abominable Church in probably every religion. And they are those who are living the doctrines of the devil, that are seeking for power, that are seeking for not the love of God, but to put themselves above their brethren, right? And I think that great and abominable church is formed more out of those people than it is necessarily a specific organization, right? Like if you were to say it's the Catholics or whoever you might pick, I think it has far more to do with the people involved, because this is where we get into the idea of the great and abominable church. There's probably a lot of early Catholic leaders, especially Medici's, that if you are looking into it, they're making some horrible mistakes. But at the same time, you have members of the Catholic Church who I believe are living the most Christian life they possibly can. And to me, that's where I land on what is the great and abominable church. It's what works do they do.
And I would say, in addition to that, I think the Book of Mormon it says there's only two churches. The Church of Christ and the Church of the Devil. And so when we talk about the great and abominable church, now some people will say or people have said, Bruce R. McConkie famously said that it was the Roman Catholic Church. And then I think it was the prophet, the president of the church was like, no, that's not correct, Bruce. You got to take that out of your book.
Chill out.
We did. But I also think that there is some truth to that. I think if you look at the history, I believe that the great and abominable church was within the Catholic Church, absolutely, along with all sorts of other institutions that perverted the work of God and that were operating against it. I think that the great and abominable church is a categorization given to distinguish between the Church of God, and it transcends the lines that we have within our own churches, because even within our own theology, there's an idea of just because you're in the church doesn't mean you are part of the church. And one is more of a, where are you spiritually, where the other one is like, are you on the records in Salt Lake City or something?
And I think this aligns very well with the way that Christ says things like, not all who say unto me, Lord, Lord, will come into heaven, right? This is how that begins to make sense, at least for me.
Yeah. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I think most Christian denominations, even Eastern Orthodoxy, believe in some type of major corruption happening. Protestants will say it's much earlier. Maybe Eastern Orthodox say it's like the 11th century. But when I've looked into this, and again, people are going to probably get upset that I'm saying this, is you look at the Council of Nicaea. You have like 1,800 bishops within the empire at that time. 300 are called to the council, approximately. And they make a decision, and it's pretty unanimous, the decision. It's how to understand the relationship between Jesus Christ and God the Father. And the word they use is homoousios. And so they all vote, and then the council decides this is how we're going forward with it. And the emperor actually enforces this by law. And so now you have this law being passed throughout the empire, and there's bishops who are not following it, who are getting like banished and things like that. It's like, well, wait a second. Is this how Christ set up his church? Like the fusion of the empire of like enforcing doctrine. And so when I think of the great and abominable church, I'm thinking we're using now the sword of the government to enforce doctrine. And that's where I start to see anytime you have corruption, you don't have the ability to think freely.
I also think that is, we talk about the great apostasy being after Christ, but I actually generally categorize that as the second great apostasy. The first happened when the government kind of took over the reins of the land of Israel. So my way of reading the Old Testament is that it's the story of the rise and fall of a kingdom. It was supposed to be the kingdom of God. And it was originally started focusing on families, right? Abraham's family, Jacob's family. But eventually it becomes a political kingdom. And it mixes its politics and its religion all together. And suddenly there's the prophets now are calling this sort of political corruption of the truth out. And it is, and basically saying, look, you guys are headed in the wrong direction with this. And then it falls and Christ comes back. Everyone is expecting, he's bringing back the political kingdom, baby. Let's go kill some Romans.
Uh-huh.
And then he's like, nope,
Nope.
this is a different kind of kingdom.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and so I think that I think you're absolutely right. When I see after Christ's death and resurrection, the politicization, the mixture of that political and religious, I see a problem.
And and the problem is this, even amongst Protestants, which is really odd, right? Your standard Protestant will be against the Catholic Church, but because the Council of Nicaea formulates the doctrine on the Trinity, they're willing to just be like, oh, let's not look at this too closely. It's like, so everyone, like, I've brought this up to people and they're like, yeah, no, that's not right. I mean, they want to uphold it because they have to have the doctrine of the Trinity. And so anyway,
which weirdly enough is not biblical, right? Like they had to have the council to declare it, right? So it's
a bold move for some farm kid to come up with, oh, actually, that's not the way it is.
Right.
And again, all of a sudden, the amount of problems that get solved, like you're talking about that puzzle, the amount of pieces that all of a sudden fall into place. It's just like, once you see it, it's hard to unsee.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you look at like a guy like Origen, who is, they're coming against the idea of modalism. And so they're proposing different theories. And it's like, well, why did this one theory get solidified and now it can't be touched? Especially when, it can't even be described by the laity.
Yeah.
Right.
And
generally, that's a problem.
Yeah. I find from people that I've spoken to, it's not necessarily believed by the laity.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. Most people in my experience, most people take the Trinity to mean that Jesus Christ is God in the sense that he's working as God, and so they don't even try to make the connections of the relation to the Holy Spirit and the one being and the three persons. They just say Jesus Christ is God, and that's how they kind of walk with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. But it's unfortunately the reason I can't accept the Trinity is because I actually dug into that it's not modalism and it's not these other things that maybe you could try and seem to make some sense of it. And when you do that, you end up like, uh-oh, like every possible solution was deemed a heresy. So
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do with one more. I have a couple. Let's go with one more.
Okay.
This has been one of my big struggles as a Lutheran looking at the Mormon Church or LDS Church. Christians have historically used some type of fruit of the vine for communion. Joseph Smith seems to have more of a pragmatic understanding, saying it doesn't really matter what we use, which I kind of appreciate if you look at some of the debates that happen regarding like yeast and bread and the types of bread to use. But why continue to use water? Why not some type of fruit juice? Why not some type of grape juice even? And for me, the water is hard because Christians historically have always done some type of fruit.
Mm-hmm.
So that for me is, and Lutherans take communion. That's like kind of like just the centerpiece of worship. It's you hear the preached word, and then you go up for communion and receive the body and blood of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Brad, do you want to go with this one first?
Yeah, this one's a really fascinating one to me because have you had a chance to read much in the Doctrine and Covenants where it talks about this?
No, yes, where it talks about this, I believe I read like the paragraph where it's stated, but not more than that. So
basically, you have this come about early on where the church has this idea that it's in fact our original sacrament meetings were done with wine at the very beginning of the church. And then as things progress, you have Joseph Smith moving into using water for this, for our sacrament meetings. And it's because it is more of a pragmatic thing, and something that I found fascinating. The symbolism is something that's tied into the cup in a lot of ways, even more than just the wine or the water. It's representing the bitter cup that Christ took. It's representing the blood of Christ, whether that's with juice or with water, is less important, I think, as long as you understand, like,
But wouldn't
this
you
is
want to wouldn't to kind of push back a little bit?
Absolutely,
Wouldn't you want a symbol that has, if it is supposed to represent the suffering of Christ and the bloodshed, wouldn't you want something that strikes the senses to some extent of the more pungent the symbol, the more real the reality of what happened to some extent?
Perhaps. And this one is fascinating. There's actually a tradition around this that we will return to using wine when the Savior comes again. And I'm trying to remember, maybe Jacob, if you know where that one is.
I haven't heard that one, but I
have
do
you not?
think so. So one of the things with this one, it's an interesting one because it's not one that has registered on my radar as something that concerns me as much, primarily because, and I can see what you're saying, like, wouldn't it be better to have a better symbol for this thing, right?
Sure.
And you could say that about any number of symbols that we have. For instance, our temple liturgy is like symbols out the wazoo, right? It's just like a highly symbolic ceremony. And there are people within the church that will, because there have been alterations to the presentation, for instance, of the endowment, to the way that it's presented and the symbols that are used. Okay. The question is, in my mind, it is, even if one symbol is better than the other, I think, like, I had it come to my head, the story of Peter, right? Where the Lord said, look, what I've deemed as clean, don't, like, this is foreign to maybe your culture. But at the end of the day, like, this is the new order of things. And I think to a certain extent, for me, I look at the sacrament, whether it's wine or water or any of that, the thing that matters to me is that this is a representation of the blood of Christ. And whatever symbol I use, I shouldn't let that stop me from recognizing what it really matters, because there's a side to this that gets tied back into, in my opinion, to Catholicism and the idea of transubstantiation. And so in the doctrines of transubstantiation, like, what is actually, like, what this is like super important. Where for a Latter-day Saint, and maybe this is something that's foreign to the traditions that you've grown up with, but to us, it's like, that isn't the point here, guys. Like, if you're thinking that there's a side of the restored gospel that is very, like, to say to that, you guys, this is bread and this is water. We are not playing in the realm of magic here, where this is going to transform into the actual blood and body of Christ. We have regular bread, regular water or juice or wine or whatever it is. And that's not the point. The point is that you are renewing your covenant with Christ through whatever medium this is, so that we don't turn out like the Jews who are obsessed with the ritual and miss the point of what the ritual is for.
Yeah. And I would invite you to think about this. The next time that you get a chance to go to church, pay special attention to the sacramental prayers and the way that they are said, the things that are said in them, because I think what Jacob is saying is very much the important aspect of this. It is about the covenant that you're making. It's not the symbols themselves, but it is the covenant with God that you've set. And if you want to read those for yourself, you can see them. And I think that they're incredible. That
Me too.
when you look at the sacramental prayers that we get from either the end of the Book of Mormon, they're in the Doctrine and Covenants as well. They are all about that covenant that we make with Christ. And we do these things in remembrance of the body of Christ and in remembrance of his blood, which was shed, in order that we might have his Spirit to be with us, and that we might always remember him and have his Spirit to be with us. And so I think, like Jacob is saying, it's just that it's more about the covenant.
Okay.
And I'm not, I don't know that there's going to be an answer that necessarily will be the perfect answer on this one. But
because part of me wonders if this isn't an outgrowth of the word of wisdom, right? Where it maybe is more traditional, that as part of doing the word of wisdom, we've moved into specifically using water when wine wouldn't necessarily be wrong, right? It's a fascinating thing, and maybe this is something like, this is one of the things that might change down the line a lot more easily than the doctrines on eternal marriage, right? Like, this is whether we're using water or wine.
Well, and this obviously is something that I feel like is something that has mattered. Is it just the matter of that you prefer another symbol, that's something that is better, or is there something deeper to why this is something that matters?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in low Protestant churches where grape juice was used, and then moving into like a higher Reformed church, and then ending up Lutheran, which is kind of just really soft Catholic. They use wine, and what it does, at least in the mind of the Lutheran. I'll speak for the church only that I belong to. It is a means outside of yourself which you connect to Christ, and so you're not looking inward, which a lot of like maybe Baptist religions and stuff like that will have, like this hyper piety and like, are you sure you're right with God? Make sure you say the sinner's prayer. Make sure you do all this. And so what the sacrament is, it's actually Christ outside yourself and what you're receiving, and you know he's present with you, and you're receiving forgiveness of sins. And so it's like this external thing that's beautiful, it's historical, it strikes the senses. It, like, kind of, for me, it's a cool thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. So when I saw water,
you feel like you're downgrading.
I do a little bit. With everything else, I feel like it's an upgrade. With the water thing, I'm like, man, why are you? Good golly, just
get some water from the Hudson. It'll strike your senses.
I think, but maybe I'll push back on this or question something.
Go ahead.
Is it like, let's say I like a certain kind of music in church. I've gone to evangelical churches, and man, they got a good band. And
you're a Hillsong guy, tight jeans,
yeah,
smoke shows, laser lights.
Exactly. And then I go into an Eastern Orthodox church, and man, I just feel like this is a downgrade, right? It's like,
yeah.
Now, I think from the outside, you look at that and say, but, and fine, fair enough. It does feel like a downgrade. This thing that you had was something of a better experience due to your own things that you've preferred, or certain traditions you've had, and even good experiences that you've had that I believe are genuine spiritual experiences within the Lutheran tradition. As you think of Christ in it, like, I don't have anything against that. I just would say that, there are things that, while they can be like, man, I don't like this kind of music as much. I don't like the kind of traditional hymns that we sing in Latter-day Saint churches, although I love our hymns. I do recognize I'm not here for the music. I'm here for the covenant. And I can tell you also that there are, like for instance, our temple liturgy. See, Latter-day Saint churches are fairly low liturgy. They're kind of like lower church. When you're in a sacrament meeting on Sunday and some, person gets up on fast and testimony meeting and starts talking about crazy stuff. But then you go to the temple and you're like high liturgy.
Yeah.
Right? high church.
Which is interesting. It's like you got two dimensions of the faith,
And
right?
Yeah.
And what's wild, a lot of Latter-day Saints are shocked by that when they go to the temple, because they, for their whole life, they've grown up going and kind of experience a lower church. And then they go and experience high church. And it's very like, whoa, this is different. Like but anyone who's experienced or understands the idea and concept of high church and high liturgy, I went to Catholic school, so I had some understanding of that a little bit. It's like, okay, this is like our version of that, and it has precedence, and it's beautiful, and there's ways to sort of understand and experience it.
Right.
But again, that, like, I can tell that liturgy, sort of that maybe higher liturgy, is something that is important to you. And I just want to like be like, well, buckle up, because we got it.
Well, it's
maybe
funny,
a sacrament
I don't
meeting
know
is not as high, but it does exist.
Are you familiar with the theologian N.T. Wright at all?
Oh, I love N.T. Wright. Big fan.
Yeah. He talks about, because he's an Anglican, and so they have like a via media framework of, an Anglican church could be really low or it could be really high, depending on where you're at. And he talks about the different dimensions of God as Father and God as King. Right. And so in a low church setting, you feel God as Father. You feel that intimate set. You feel God as, you're working with other people.
Jesus is my homie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in a higher church setting, you feel the regalness of God, the authority, and the kingdom of heaven. Right. And so it's interesting, because I grew up low Protestant, and now I'm kind of high Protestant a little bit. And so I have both, and I'm like, I appreciate both. There's beauties to both, honestly. But you guys do have both. So there you go.
And it's funny, Brad, that he said that, because I'm going to be using that when I talk to people about the temple.
Yeah.
And that it's like experiencing God as Father versus experiencing God as King.
Yeah.
In
That's
sort of
beautiful.
that regal setting. I can tell you right now,
such a good way to put it.
If you go to the temple one day, God willing, that would be, if you want to experience God as King, I can tell you that experience you will experience God as King.
That's awesome.
It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. So. Dude, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah. This has been awesome. I got to speak with two apologists, and you guys, honestly, I appreciate the way you guys flesh out your ideas, and you're honest, and the big thing is, when you don't know, and that's awesome too. And listen, this has been really great.
Awesome. Dude. Well, we are super happy to talk with you, man.
I've just loved hearing your questions, and the sincerity of your questions, and the way that you've thought them through, and you're being willing to share them with us. That's amazing. That is fantastic. And I really do think that this is exactly what God wants us to be doing, because everything about what God wants us to be doing edifies everyone involved. We have just learned new good things right now, just in what you've just said, with Jacob now knowing, hey, low church, God is your Father. High church, you experience God as King. Like, there are things and truths that that, by the way, won't just be helpful for us in our conversations, but in the local congregation when you get a chance to go there. There are things that God has taught you, and experiences that you've had, that will enable you to lift others in all of these amazing ways. And that, I think, is why God has us all figuring it out, right? To see, will we take that opportunity to figure it out and lift our neighbor, right? That's how we
think about it, and meditate on it, and really search yourself, and be honest about the tensions of your worldview, right?
Yes.
Don't run away from those.
No. Yeah.
And to recognize you even have one. I think one of the things that sort of the atheist agnostic types, what they do is they just run from their worldview. They just adopt whatever. They don't ever really explore it. They don't dig deep into the real questions of the human soul that we can find such another level of depth and sort of meaning in our lives with. And I just want to end with this sort of analogy. Because a lot of people experience me on my channel in more of an apologetic mode. I'm having the rational conversation, that half of it. And I'm big on that. I'm a big believer in that, right? I believe in a rational faith. But people don't get to experience what I actually sort of believe is the thing that gets you over the line. And that is something akin, I use this analogy. I could sit here and tell you about this great song I heard. I could just talk till I'm blue in the face about it. I can talk about the scientific theories about the way the notes went together and all of that. But you got to hear the music. And I love the music analogy because my life and my faith, when you get down to it, it's less like a scientific analysis and it's more like participating in a beautiful song. I love to sing our hymns because in my mind, they're the perfect fusion of beautiful, sort of poetic truth. And I'm big on truth, but it's set to music. And the music is what gives it the magic. It's what gives life the magic. That's what I believe our spiritual lives are. They're the music. That's why when you lose your spirituality, you lose your soul. Your life becomes a series of numbers and formulas instead of a beautiful dance in a world filled with light and magic. And you can't put that in a test tube. You can't put it into a formula. You just gotta hear it.
Yeah.
And that's what I hope that you have in this experience beyond any of the intellectual arguments, because that's the thing where God will reveal to you that where he wants you to go. And it's my testimony that he wants you to make a covenant with him through his restored church.
That's awesome.
Amen.
Man. Thank you guys so much.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button so my future videos show up on your feed. Also, if you or someone that you know has benefited from the content here on Thoughtful Faith, please consider becoming a channel donor or volunteer by visiting my new website, thoughtfulfaith.org, and clicking on the Get Involved page.